Good evening. I'm Don Gadsky, Dean of the School of Architecture at the University of Texas at Arlington, and I'm delighted to have this opportunity to welcome you all, our audience, guests, our speakers, to the first David Dillon Symposium on Texas Architecture. I would like to note that while this is the first Dillon Symposium, it is actually the fourth of a series of symposia that the school has offered on topics ranging from the work of the architect Frank Welch to shopping in Texas and to the history of African American architects in Dallas. Those were organized as part of our Texas Architectural Oral History Project, which has now been absorbed into the larger mission of the David Dillon Center for Texas Architecture, our newest research initiative at the School of Architecture. You'll learn a bit more about that, about the Dillon Center in a moment from its director, Dr. Catherine Holliday. But its fundamental purpose is the documentation, critical evaluation, and public discussion of architecture, urban and metropolitan development, culture, and the arts in the state of Texas and the region of the United States. We couldn't do this, perhaps more importantly, we wouldn't do it without the support of friends and of the community. So let me publicly thank those who have made this event possible. First, Sally Dillon, who I'm pleased to note is here with us this evening. Sally, would you mind standing up for a moment? Sally had the generosity and the confidence to donate her husband's professional papers to the University of Texas at Arlington, and which will become the intellectual core of the center's resources. I'd also like to thank the Eugene McDermott Foundation and Dee Dee and Rusty Rose for their financial support of the center. I need to thank the Dallas Morning News also for its financial support and for its assistance in publicity and promotion of this event, and we look forward to developing a long working relationship with the Morning News. I also need to thank the Dallas Museum of Art and the Nasher Sculpture Center for their hospitality and use of their facilities. And finally, our co-host for this event, both tonight and for the symposium tomorrow, and also for the previous Texas Architectural Oral History Project symposia, and that's the Dallas Architecture Forum, with the particular assistance of Nate Udaly, the executive director. For over 15 years now, the forum has been providing for very high quality programming and supporting the discussion of architecture in our area, and we anticipate a continuing collaboration in advancing both of our missions. We're looking forward to a stimulating presentation this evening, and then continuing with the events tomorrow night, or tomorrow morning, next door at the Nasher Sculpture Center. We have a really stellar lineup of national experts. So let me now turn this over to Dr. Kate Holliday, Assistant Professor of Architecture and Director of the David Dillon Center.
Well, it's a real pleasure to welcome you all here this evening to be a part of this first inaugural David Dillon Symposium. And as Don mentioned, we founded the Dillon Center for Texas Architecture at UTA to foster public dialogue about architecture and urbanism in North Texas. David Dillon was a reliable and a consistent voice on that subject for more than 25 years at the Dallas Morning News. And in his absence, and in the general upheaval in the publishing industry, it becomes more crucial every day to think about new ways to keep discussions of architecture a central part of our daily lives. In forming our mission for the center, we have consciously considered the things that universities do well so that we can complement other existing institutions in the city and region. In the university context, we have the benefit of doing long-term, detail-oriented research. Much of that fascinating work needs to be communicated more effectively to the public, which has a vested interest in many of the questions that we tried to answer about the way our city has grown in the past 50 to 60 years. Our oral history projects, digital initiatives, and this symposium are all ways that we will increasingly use our own internal investigations to reach out to the wider public. And I also would like to thank Sally Dillon, who's here, for her generous donation of David's archive. His archive is now preserved for public research in UT Arlington's library. I've had the opportunity to use some of David's materials myself for some research, and I'm looking forward to delving into them even further. His papers include research materials, reporters' notebooks, edited manuscripts, published articles, published books, scrapbooks, recorded interviews, and it's a real treasure trove, both for thinking about architectural journalism and for thinking about architecture here in our region. They represent the broad range of David's writing from the early 1980s until 2010, and they show the careful, thoughtful approach that he brought to his work. And reading through David's more than 1,000 articles for the Dallas Morning News alone, you get a sense for the passion that he brought to thinking about architecture and the way that it affects our daily lives. He wrote about highways, about museums, sports arenas, also about neighborhoods, the need for clear policies of urban growth. Architecture criticism, as David practiced it, had a broad disciplinary reach. It meant our city, the entire built and man-made world that surrounds us, and he left an important legacy for us all by shaping the way we think and talk about Dallas. Tonight's lecture and tomorrow's symposium, which is just across the street of the Nasher, where we'll have 7 more distinguished speakers, all critics and writers, are designed both to celebrate David's career and to think about what we do next. We are a city and an entire region now without a dedicated architecture writer at our daily newspaper. And this has been the traditional home of architecture criticism since its earliest days in the 1870s, when critics like Montgomery Schuyler wrote for both architecture magazines and newspapers. Almost a century later, by the 1960s, when Ada Louise Huxtable began her career at the New York Times, most major daily newspapers in the U.S. began to have architecture critics as well. This kind of writing is different than what we find in architecture magazines because it is intended for the public. It is different from much of the writing about architecture that makes it into newspapers today, that ties so closely to real estate and to art criticism. Architecture criticism is different. It focuses on buildings and neighborhoods and the connection of architecture to our sense of place and our sense of who we are. There is something special about architecture, long considered the most social of the arts. And to put it simply, it is such a big subject, one that surrounds us, literally, and one that requires sustained attention and a special ability to talk about the experience of being somewhere and understanding how it affects others. So on that note, I would like to introduce tonight's speaker, Paul Goldberger, who has developed his own wise and insightful approach to architecture from his home base of New York City. Before I do that, let me please note that he has generously agreed to sign copies of his book, Why Architecture Matters, after the lecture this evening, and after questions after his lecture, just head down to the DMA bookstore, and that book signing will take place there. But Mr. Goldberger began his career at a newspaper, the New York Times, before moving to the New Yorker in 1997. And just a couple of weeks ago, he announced that he was leaving to become architecture and design critic for Vanity Fair, opening an entirely new chapter. He also holds the Joseph Urban Chair in Design and Architecture at the New School. In addition to his columns, he has written numerous books from 1979's The City Observes on the Architecture of New York to more recent collections of his essays like Building Up and Tearing Down and Why Architecture Matters, just down the hallway. He's working on a monograph on the architect Frank Gehry that I understand will be finished in the next couple of years. In 1984, he won the Pulitzer Prize for his distinguished writing on architecture in the New York Times, and he has won many other honors as well, which are too numerous to list here. But to give you a sense of the broad range, they include the New York Public Library's Literary Lion Award from 1993 and the New York City Landmarks Preservation Commission's Preservation Achievement Award from 1996. So without further ado, let me please introduce Paul Goldberger.
Thank you very much, Kate. It's a great pleasure to be here to mark the official opening of this conference and to honor the memory of David Dillon, who is the sort of critic every city needs, and it seems to me fewer and fewer cities now have. You know, when you read his pieces, the thing that leaps out at you is the sense that he had no agenda, or at least no ideological or stylistic one. His agenda was a better Dallas, and the belief that architecture was a key part of creating that better Dallas, and that the city owed architecture and planning professionals respect and the opportunity to demonstrate their best ideas, and that they, in turn, owed the city their best work. He was an advocate for quality, a word that gets tossed around so much today it's been stripped of a lot of its meaning. But in David Dillon's writing, you could get a sense of what quality was. It meant care and precision and faithfulness to both formal ideas and practical use. It also meant that no building could be viewed as a pure object, apart from its context. You're struck when you look back at his writing by the extent to which he focused on planning and public issues that affect the built environment. He never evaluated architecture as an isolated object. He saw it as a living object, if a relatively static kind of one within the larger and changing object of the city itself. But he never took only the large and distant view. In a single review of a single project, he had the ability to write about the city and write about the larger image of a piece of architecture, and at the same time, he could bore right into it like a laser, coming close and examining and evaluating its details. If God is in the details, as Mies van der Rohe is reported to have said, then these office towers are at best agnostic. He wrote in 1986 of Philip Johnson and John Berge's Crescent complex here in Dallas. He then proceeded to take apart the mix of corporate America and Napoleon, as he called this bizarre relic of what seems, with the benefit of more than 2 decades of hindsight, to have been Philip Johnson's most bizarre period. But he never took the easy swipes at this project. He tried hard to acknowledge what Johnson was trying to do and to judge it first on its own terms, which is to say he didn't immediately denounce the very notion of a French provincial skyscraper, even if it did, as he did write, contain, and I quote, probably the world's first French provincial drive-in bank. He started out by analyzing the project as a work of planning and urban design, and called it an awkward hybrid of the urban and suburban, in which even the good planning gestures were overwhelmed by total servitude to the automobile. And then he zeroed in on the architecture itself. The mansard roofs, with their finials and frilly ridges, make a pleasant, if somewhat kitschy, skyline decoration, he wrote, and then went on to toss a left-handed compliment. At least they are designed to be seen against the sky, as Francois Mansard intended, rather than being pushed down over the brow of the building like oversized hats. But the metal and glass bay windows in the center of each tower look like cheap afterthoughts, especially in combination with the elegant Indiana limestone. And the base of the building is a complete flop, too slight and unarticulated for such a massive facade. It's as though the weight of the towers has pressed it into the earth, leaving only a narrow band of polished granite showing. On a building that works so hard to evoke older architecture, in which the clear division of a building into base, shaft, and top was axiomatic, this is not a minor slip. See, I'm enjoying reading this so much, I think I'll give you just a tiny bit more. Spreading over, above, and around the Crescent like a kind of architectural psoriasis is the cast aluminum grillwork, David wrote. Whatever value it has as decorative or scaling device is offset by its riotous proliferation. No surface or shape has been spared. The architects explain these details as a grander expression of early Texas architecture and point to precedents along the Texas Gulf Coast, such as Nicholas Clayton's Ashton Villa in Galveston. But most of these older structures are less than 4 stories tall, and their ironwork was manufactured on the East Coast and shipped in. It's about as indigenous, then, as the mansard roof on the neighborhood McDonald's. Now, there are many other pieces like this one, but for our purposes tonight, we'll have to allow this single one to stand for all of David Dillon. His commitment to urbanity, his belief in quality, his freedom from ideology, and perhaps most of all, his fundamental fairness. All things considered, it's a gentle review. I don't think David took any real pleasure in bringing out the scalpel. And whenever he wrote negatively, there was always an air of slight disappointment. You felt he truly wished the thing he was writing about had been better, and that the architect or the developer or the public official or all of them had somehow let him down. You always felt he never gave up hope that the next one would be better. Now, that earnestness would have been insufferable if it had not been combined with such sophistication, intelligence, knowledge of history, and sense of realism. But together with these other qualities, David's earnestness gave him a belief and a passion which energized all his writing and pushed it forward. To say that Dallas is a better city because of his voice is to speak the obvious. If the phrase conscience of a city is a bit of a cliche, I can't think of an alternative that describes David's role in Dallas any better. There was another quality to David Dillon's work, and let me use it as a way into a broader discussion of some issues of architecture criticism. He was comfortable being a reporter as much as a critic. He knew that facts were a foundation of criticism, and he took pleasure in digging them up. He didn't only write about what he saw then, he wrote about what he learned and what he turned up when he investigated. That's why he could write about, say, cost overruns at the Meyerson Symphony Hall, and make them, as much as the physical form of the building, a way of contextualizing what he had to say. Budgetary issues weren't themselves an architectural judgment, and he had no desire to make them one, but he saw them as part of the story, a part he was obliged to his readers to discuss. I don't know how much of that we have any longer. It requires an author willing and able to play reporter, as well as a newspaper prepared to devote the resources to supporting that kind of journalism. Of course, I do have to admit that right now, it seems as if all of Dallas is talking about a story that's a wonderful example of that kind of thorough reporting of an architectural issue, the long piece by Tim Rogers in the current issue of D Magazine about Museum Tower. It's certainly a very real example of the kind of writing I'm referring to, even though it isn't written with a fundamental focus on architectural issues, but it's a strong and important piece, and so given that it is the talk of the town at the moment, it may seem a bit odd for me to come to Dallas and complain about the need for more in-depth reporting on issues connected to architecture. But my point still holds. This particular piece may just be the exception that proves the rule. It's tough to do that kind of reporting, say, for a blog, or for a newspaper or a magazine that's cut its expenses to the bone. Or, if you're an architecture critic, writing for a newspaper that expects you to appear in print or online so frequently that you don't ever have enough of that other resource besides money that good reporting requires, which is time. I mention all of this because I think if we have a problem in architecture criticism today, it's at least as much a function of the broader crisis in journalism, which, as I hardly need tell anyone in this room, has affected every mainstream publication there is, from the smallest to the largest. I think it's fair to say that no publication is as powerful as it once was, that nothing, not the New York Times, not the New Yorker, not anything, has a kind of hegemony that it once did. No institution dominates in such a way as to be able to set the agenda for architecture criticism any more than any single media organization today can set the agenda for anything else. The context of the overall media landscape is simply too different. And it's changed more completely in the last 10 or 15 years than in the 75 years before that. Television, despite expectations to the contrary, didn't threaten print journalism as the internet has. It just added another medium to the mix without distracting significantly from the economic power or the authority of the mainstream print media. Now, of course, it's another story altogether. Even those publications that have established reasonably successful presences online, like the New York Times, don't hold sway over the world as they once did. If, as A.J. Liebling famously said, freedom of the press belongs mainly to those who own one, well then, today, of course, everybody owns the equivalent of a press. Technology means that the playing field is leveled, and now there are a zillion voices out there, all clamoring to be heard. Now, if everyone is on the playing field, I'm not sure what kind of game you can have on it, however. And a level playing field certainly doesn't mean that the score is automatically tied. The mainstream publications, the ones with a tradition and a history and an ongoing commitment to architecture criticism, certainly continue to possess continuing authority. The New York Times architecture column isn't building blog. But to many readers, particularly younger ones, it isn't all that different. And what greater authority it has is seen by many readers as more of a historical leftover, a form of inheritance, than as a matter of current-day relevance. In any event, whether seen as possessing greater authority or not, mainstream publications struggle to make themselves heard within this new and constantly shifting mix, as well as to shoulder the costs of maintaining what we might call the physical infrastructure of print. In many ways, the situation of print publications today is not unlike that of retail merchants with brick-and-mortar stores to maintain, struggling to hold their own against internet competition. Well, I don't think the plight of newspapers today is the exact equivalent of, say, Best Buy trying to compete against Amazon. It's closer than we might have ever expected it would be. What makes it different is the fact that there is no media equivalent of Amazon, since another effect technology has had has been to break up the audience into smaller and smaller and more specialized segments. The effect of this goes far beyond the realm of architecture criticism, of course. The turmoil in journalism, as I've said, affects every discipline. But I think architecture criticism has special challenges. One of them is that new media is particularly tempting, especially now because it's easier and easier to transmit images. I had a long conversation about new media with my architecture criticism class at Parsons last week, and they concluded that blogs, to them, were now kind of old hat. The future, they insisted, was in image-driven apps like Tumblr and Pinterest. I can sort of see the point. New media, whether in the form of blogs or Pinterest or Twitter, makes pictures of everything available all the time, instantly, and new images can spread like wildfire. That has its usefulness in architecture that it doesn't, say, in literary criticism. The idea of media functioning as a kind of continuously scrolling portfolio, showing you everyone's new work all the time, does have a certain appeal, and certainly plays to the strengths of this technology. Everything is now shorthand, either visual shorthand or written shorthand, one of my students said, and this is right again. The challenges are in how you filter all this stuff and in the random way in which we encounter it, given how this new level playing field is so full of players that, as I said a moment ago, I'm not sure how the game even proceeds. Maybe a better metaphor might be that of the curator. Who is going to curate all of the material that pours across our computer screens all the time? It never stops, as you know. While I've been standing here talking, I've missed hundreds of tweets. And a handful of them might even be interesting or be links to things that are interesting. Plenty of the things I discover this way are things I might not otherwise have seen. And for that, too, new media is invaluable. I don't know how I functioned before Arc News Now, the daily feed of links to architecture, news, and criticism from around the world. And now there is Architect's Newspaper and Architect Magazine and Dezeen and Arc Daily and Sucker Punch Daily and so many other sources, not to mention a zillion tweets all dumping data across my screen. Next to Twitter, an early and relatively discursive blog like Design Observer seems as loquacious as Lewis Mumford. There's almost too much architecture visible in various forms of media, and yet there is not enough architecture criticism. I have to admit some fear that Alexandra Lang's excellent new book, Writing About Architecture, which was published just this spring, will turn out to be an elegy to a fading craft, something I am quite sure she did not intend or would want it to be. But what we might call long-form writing about architecture has always had a tentative status within the world of journalism. Even when print ruled the world and long-form journalism, long-form writing was more the norm in every field, the position of architecture criticism as a discipline worthy of critical attention wasn't really all that secure, despite the presence of such towering figures as Mumford and Ada Louise Huxtable, and the Pulitzer Prize Board's decision in 1970 to make Huxtable the very first winner of the then-new category of Pulitzer for distinguished criticism. You couldn't ask for more recognition of the value of architecture as an appropriate subject for critical inquiry than that decision 42 years ago to honor an architecture critic with a Pulitzer Prize in criticism before any music critic, film critic, art critic, or theater critic had been so honored. Since then, 5 other architecture critics have won the prize, and 4 others have been named as finalists, a remarkable number when you consider how few architecture critics there actually are. As a percentage of total practicing architecture critics, the number who have been either Pulitzer Prize winners or finalists has to be many times that of film critics, theater critics, or music or art critics. And yet, this is still considered a marginal subject for criticism. So in times of economic pressure, when newspapers are closing bureaus and laying off reporters, an architecture critic's position is among the most vulnerable. And we all know that the less architecture criticism there is, the lower the demand for it becomes, since good writing creates interest that brings about demand. And the absence of writing is felt mainly by people like most of us in this room already committed to this field, not by people who do not know what they're not getting. So it's a vicious cycle in which reducing the amount of architecture criticism reduces the sense that it is important and worthwhile. But I think that architecture criticism is a tough sell for many editors, not only because of the state of the economy and because of the wrenching transitions technology is bringing to journalism. It's also because, despite the fame of some of architecture criticism's practitioners and the accolades bestowed upon them, many people aren't entirely sure what it actually is and what it should be doing. It's a paradox, because we're living in a time when architecture is more than ever part of the public discourse, when people know architects' names, when they pay attention to what gets built. and the whole phenomenon known as starchitecture, a truly awful word, seems to many of us in the field to have become almost too much a part of the culture, so that we often feel a responsibility not to fan those flames even more. Still, I have to admit that however infuriating the starchitecture phenomenon can be, it hasn't been an entirely bad thing for architecture, because it has put it more than ever in the public eye. I know that inevitably means that ideas are simplified and often cheapened and vulgarized, causing understandable distress among those who cherish the notion of architecture as an intellectual pursuit. And it can be infuriating to see architecture treated as part of the culture of celebrity, not to mention to have to listen to the constant refrains from architects about how much they hate the word starchitect, which seem invariably to come disingenuously from the architects who court publicity the most. The latest is Richard Rogers, who the other day told the Financial Times that he hated the term because, and I quote, "I don't like star anything. In the end, we are all people." Perhaps a slightly curious vote for egalitarianism from someone who is known officially as Lord Rogers of Riverside. In any case, as I said, much as I too hate the cheap glitter of the term, I'm disinclined to dismiss the phenomenon entirely, since it has also brought architecture more fully into the public realm, made it more central to civic discussion. And as it's hypocritical for architects to revel in public attention while pretending to be above it, it's equally hypocritical for architecture critics to take the position that there is not some potential social good in the greater visibility of architecture, however annoying some of its specific manifestations may be. In any event, all of this has to be relevant to the larger questions that bring us all here. What is the state of architecture criticism today? Why should architecture criticism exist? Does it make any real difference? Can it do more than just entertain and enlighten a few readers who come to it already interested in architecture? Or can it truly shape a city? And how is new media going to change it? We've just been talking about two opposing trends, two conflicting sets of facts. On the one hand, there's the crisis in journalism, inevitably adding pressure to what has not, even in different times, been what anyone would call a large field. Architecture critics have never been all that plentiful. But on the other hand, there's the greater sense of engagement that people almost everywhere seem to have now with the built environment, the heightened sense of caring about what their houses and streets and neighborhoods and downtowns and public spaces will look like and feel like to use. The mysterious thing is how architecture criticism seems often not to be capable of addressing these things in a way that those who employ architecture critics, which is to say, editors, appear to find meaningful. I'm as willing as anyone to lay at least some of the blame at the feet of editors, so many of whom still seem not to understand our field very well. But I think that we as critics need to take some responsibility too. Architecture criticism has too often removed itself from the very public discourse that architecture itself has entered. I don't think that paroxysms of pleasure at the latest swoops and curves of Zaha Hadid, or repetitions of Rem Koolhaas's latest disingenuous pronouncements about the irrelevance of architecture, or celebrations of a certain young Danish architect who's become the latest celebrity architect with such astonishing speed that it makes the careers of the first two people I've just mentioned seem almost plodding. All of these things are, to one degree or another, inside baseball. And they serve mainly to accentuate the gap between architecture criticism and the lay public, who, whether they choose to participate in a dialogue about architecture or not, are, after all, its users, at least so far as public architecture is concerned. This, of course, makes architecture different from anything else that's generally considered to fall within the realm of criticism. You choose the music you hear, the films you see, the books you read, the theater you attend. But other than the house you live in, you almost never choose the architecture you experience. It's imposed upon you often by forces over which you have little or no control. When architecture criticism is doing its job, it helps you understand these forces at least a little bit better and gives you at least some agency over them. Not much, I know, but some. And it should give you at least some understanding of how things come to be, of why they are as they are, and of how else they might be imagined. The ubiquity of architecture in our lives should lead to a demand for much more architecture criticism, for much more writing of every kind about it. But I think it sometimes works in the opposite way. Because architecture is always there, always around us, always visible, yet seemingly so uncontrollable by us, we tend to tune it out. And by we, of course, I mean the average person, the potential reader of architecture criticism, not critics themselves. I think people develop a kind of automatic numbness to architecture that, or to a lot of the architecture that they see every day, as a kind of protective measure. It's not just because some of it is too painful to look at. It's more because most of it is just too much trouble to look very hard at. There's too much of it all over the place at every moment, and it's hard to pay attention to. And harder still for many people to have any sense that it matters, that the architecture around them can have any effect on their lives. It's the implicit mission of architecture criticism to help people understand that architecture does matter, of course, and why it does. That's why I'm not all that distressed at the recent trend toward more socially oriented architecture criticism. Even at the New York Times, where the current new critic has done an abrupt and total about-face from the position of his two most recent predecessors, neither of whom seem to view political process, issues of urban design, or the social utility of buildings as a priority. If the Times lately has seemed to define architecture as narrowly in one direction as it once did in another, I'm hopeful that in time there will be a more inclusive balance, as there's been for some time at both the Los Angeles Times in Chris Hawthorne's writing and the Chicago Tribune in Blair Kamin's, both of which have a long tradition of architecture criticism as relating to the broader issues of the city, and where these two critics have for several years now very successfully balanced political, cultural, and aesthetic concerns, not to mention been entirely comfortable writing about single buildings as well as about preservation issues and about planning and about urban design, just as David Dillon was. Architecture criticism, like architecture itself, needs to be comfortable on multiple scales and to be written with the recognition that different circumstances demand different kinds of writing. It needs, in other words, to be comfortable with the notion that architecture is art and is not art at once, that it is an experience of the everyday and also, potentially, an experience of the transcendent. Criticism needs to take both sides of this equation as its subject. Buildings do not just happen. They are the products of a peculiar combination of artistic vision, money, political wherewithal, and engineering skill. To the extent to which it is possible to say something about the process by which buildings happen, the critic has to, not to excuse the results. No critic should ever do that, but to place the building within a context that enhances its meaning. You understand Palladio a lot better if you know that the villas he designed around Vicenza in the 16th century were not just expressions of classical grandeur, but attempts to enhance the image of his aristocratic clients whose houses were, as often as not, working farms. You understand Herzog and de Meuron's Bird's Nest Stadium and Norman Foster's Beijing Airport better if you see them as having been made possible by the mix of high aesthetic ambition and cheap mass labor that exists in China right now and that may not exist for too much longer. While you do not absolutely need to know that the Basques in northern Spain were eager to remake the old industrial city of Bilbao when they turned to Frank Gehry and the Guggenheim Museum to give them a new symbol of that region, and that they wanted the building both to stand out and to reflect to and connect to the city, you will surely understand Gehry's remarkable building better if you know something of its origins and can recognize that there are more complicated and subtle ways to demonstrate respect for context than replication. Still, when we strip away the layers of politics and real estate finance and zoning and construction and get beyond the arguments about what kind of environment is best for educating people or healing people or housing people, we are left with the reality that the building is an object. That's what buildings are. Physical objects with walls, floors, ceilings, roofs, doors, and windows, which look a particular way and function a particular way. Evaluating how a building looks as a physical object and how it functions will always be the core of the obligation of architecture criticism. So my point is only to say that if the core of the responsibility of the critic is to consider the building as an object, that certainly cannot be the whole of his or her responsibility. But I think every critic still needs to feel that the greatest moments of all are those when he or she calls attention to those buildings that, in Mumford's words, cause people to hold their breath for a stabbing moment, or that restore them to equilibrium by offering them a prospect of space and form joyfully mastered. Matthew Arnold defined criticism as a disinterested endeavor to learn and propagate the best that is known and thought in the world. Implicit within that is the obligation to share your judgments as well as your enthusiasms. Both judgment and enthusiasm can be ways of expressing love, and a critic who does not love his field cannot last long in it. To love the thing, whether we call it architecture, design, planning, or whatever, and also to love what it means in other people's lives and not only your own, is, I think it's fair to say, a further prerequisite to functioning well as a journalistic critic. That's not inconsistent with exercising judgment. Judgment and education go hand in hand and are parts of a critic's role as a kind of interpreter to communicate his or her love of things and, in so doing, instill love in others. A key difference between an architect and a critic, or a theoretician and a critic, is that in both cases the former, the architect or the theoretician, has a right, even an obligation, to proceed from a theoretical viewpoint, while no such obligation exists for a critic. Indeed, I think the opposite is closer to the truth. A critic should not believe that there is only one right way to do things. The belief that there is only a single solution to a problem can strengthen the work of an architect and enable the thinking of a theorist. You don't want an architect who sees too many ways to go and who does not feel a passionate drive toward one of them. But that worldview weakens the work of the critic, who needs to proceed from a pluralist position, at least nominally. If not, he or she forfeits their ability to interpret, explain, and judge the work that is before them. But a critic has to stand for something, obviously. He or she cannot proceed from the view that anything at all is acceptable as long as it's well done. So how do you combine an absence of rigid ideology with some guiding principles that are necessary for criticism? The answer, I think, lies in the difference between what we might call social or moral or ethical issues and aesthetic ones, between issues of social and political responsibility and issues of aesthetic choice. A critic can and should establish a set of social and political principles that define his or her judgment and act as a foundation for his or her criticism. The challenge is to hold on to those principles and at the same time remain open to a broader range of aesthetic responses to those principles than any one architect might have, and then to be able to judge those different aesthetic responses on their own terms. To say it one more time, I believe architecture exists in a social and political context and almost always needs to be judged within that context. The issue of the relationship between aesthetics and politics seems especially relevant today, in an age in which there's been a significant surge of conservative political sentiment, which has sometimes seemed to be paired with pressure for conservative or traditional architectural solutions. Now, I hesitate to suggest a causal relationship here. I really don't believe that conservative politics automatically equals an insistence on traditional architecture, or conversely, that a preference for traditional architecture necessarily connects to conservative politics. Those automatic associations are silly at best and quite dangerous at worst. But still, that being said, the climate is an odd one right now when the biggest architectural story in Washington is not the glare of a tower, but the attack on the Frank Gehry design for the Eisenhower Memorial, much of which seems to be motivated by a demand that the memorial be redesigned in the classical style, an insistence that has often been accompanied by a suggestion that Gehry's design shows insufficient respect for the principles and politics of Eisenhower. In the age of the Tea Party, of course, Eisenhower seems hardly a bona fide Republican anymore, since his politics would hardly pass muster with the Tea Party. By comparison to this year's crop of presidential candidates, you could almost think of him as something of a lefty. But this only makes this story even more complicated. The problem in this case is how to separate the concept of an official style, which is what the opponents seem to believe classicism should be in Washington, from the challenge of creating an effective and moving memorial to an unusual and important figure in modern American history, the only man since Ulysses S. Grant to have served both as an important general in a major war and as President of the United States. Should this man of the 20th century be memorialized with essentially the same kind of architecture that Grant was in the 19th century? I think there's nothing immoral in doing that, but it is hardly essential. And recent experience in Washington, if the World War II memorial is any guide, suggests that we are no longer able to design classical memorials with the power and grace that we did in the days of Henry Bacon and John Russell Pope. The greatest memorial of our time isn't the recent World War II memorial, but Maya Lin's extraordinary Vietnam Veterans Memorial, which of course was also opposed bitterly by some who said that modernism was incapable of creating a memorial that would communicate adequately to the vast numbers of people who would see it, that it was an elite style, cold and abstract, revealing hostility rather than patriotism. I would have thought that the success of the Vietnam Veterans Memorial and the brilliance and power with which it does communicate to everyone would have been sufficient to have opened the door to a greater willingness to continue to invent new forms of expression to honor great Americans. But no such luck. The battle now bears an eerie similarity to the ones that took place more than 30 years ago. The one difference, ironically, is that the Eisenhower Memorial is also being criticized as representing the wrong process, since the architect was chosen not through an open competition, but through the General Services Administration's Design Excellence Program, which has a superb record of raising the level of federal design and that has hardly been a system of cronyism. I'm not sure, by the way, that the Gehry design can't be improved. There are several aspects of it that I'm somewhat unsure about myself. But I raise it here to make a very different point, that it can't be discussed in purely formal or aesthetic terms without at least some discussion of the difficult political context in which this controversy plays out. And the dismissive and hostile tone of the arguments here is deeply troubling as a testament to where the public discourse about architecture stands right now. No more encouraging is the situation in upstate New York, where one of Paul Rudolph's public buildings, the 1971 Orange County Government Center, is closed because of water damage after a hurricane, and the county executive wants to tear it down and replace it with a mock Georgian structure of brick. Now, Paul Rudolph is difficult, and in general, his buildings are not what you would describe as user-friendly. They certainly do not recede into the background. But at their best, they're extraordinary investigations into the nature of space and surface, and they place human activity within a dynamic set of forms that at its best is ennobling. They are buildings that demand more from us and that give us more in return. It's the obligation of architecture criticism to explain that equation and to help people make a judgment as to whether its price is worth paying. Unfortunately, this particular situation is colored by, big surprise here, nasty disputes about money as well as style, since the advocates of tearing down the building show studies that purport to prove that renovation is more expensive than new construction, and advocates of keeping the building have numbers that suggest exactly the opposite. Probably the particular solution the county executive wants, the banal Georgian building, is cheaper because it's as plain vanilla a building as you could imagine. It lacks not only architectural ambition, it also lacks the dignity and grander ambitions of Rudolph, who truly wanted to make a statement about the importance of civic life and the high value citizens could place on the workings of their government. He also, of course, wanted to make a statement about innovation, about fresh thinking and new ideas, things that it often seems were valued in government more a generation ago than they are today. Whatever else you can say about the Rudolph building, it's not government architecture for the age of the Tea Party. But this brings us to another question, which is the extent to which architecture critics have a responsibility to support the new, a responsibility to the avant-garde. If they don't, the argument might go, who will, outside of architects themselves? There's some truth to this, although I have a visceral reaction against critics who support the new reflexively, as automatically as some critics reject it. But I do think it's worth remembering that in architecture criticism, as in art criticism, the critics whose voices have mattered most over time have been the ones who bring to the table at least a significant degree of sympathy for the new. Mumford and Huxtable did not become the most enduring critical voices of the 20th century by virtue of rejecting innovation and invention. They did not accept it uncritically and they often judged it harshly. But there was always a sense of belief in the notion that as architects throughout history had looked for new ways to make form, so can architects today. And the critic can and should encourage the best of them. In art criticism, consider how many people today remember Royal Cortizos, the famously reactionary critic of the New York Herald Tribune, as compared to, say, Clement Greenberg or Harold Rosenberg, the greatest mid-century advocates of the new. John Cannaday, the art critic of the New York Times, when the Guggenheim Museum opened in 1959, is little remembered for his impassioned denunciation of Wright's great building, even though some of his points about the building's functional drawbacks were true. His writing today appears more like a desperate attempt to swim upstream against the current, or to reject out of fear what he did not understand. If architecture matters, it should go without saying that criticism matters. It is, after all, the closest thing we have to a living guide to architecture, what it means and how it affects us. But to say that criticism matters because architecture matters is not enough, because criticism needs to matter on its own terms as well. It matters if it can change architecture, and it matters if it can change people's lives, helping them to understand the architecture they live with and to make it better. For a long time, critics yearned for an age when people paid attention to architecture, when society cared about it and talked about it. Beware of what you wish for, as they say, for we've now gotten that wish, and of course it's a mixed bag. If we once expected too little of architecture, I worry that today some of us may sometimes expect too much of it. It's worth remembering, I think, that architecture does not cure cancer, and it does not put bread on the table. It is not justice in the courtroom, and it is not peace on the battlefield. If there is anything the critic needs to be mindful of today, it's that architecture does not solve all of our problems. It does not sustain life, but it can make the already sustained life much more meaningful, much more pleasurable. And it's the critic's job, in a way, to observe and encourage and support that process, enhancing the impact of architecture as a resonant presence in all of our lives. Thank you. Thank you very much.
We have about 10 minutes or so for questions.
Sure.
Anyone would like to get us started?
Yes, sir.
I'm curious, what was your initial response the first time you saw the World Trade Center memorial?
I think the World Trade Center memorial is pretty good, actually. I think it's the one piece of the overall development of that 16-acre site that has turned out just about as well as we might expect. It's interesting that it's the only part of the site that was chosen through an open competition, not unlike the Vietnam Veterans Memorial. And as in that case, a young architect with relatively little experience and with a very strong and simple idea prevailed. And somehow, despite the insanely political and also economically driven process at ground zero, it seems to have more or less survived with some degree of compromise, but nothing that I consider critical to its basic ideas. So I think it's actually pretty good. And I would go so far as to say that it's the best modern memorial in this country since Maya Lin's Vietnam Veterans Memorial in Washington. I don't think of it in the context of the Eisenhower thing, only because I was thinking completely about official Washington things, which it's not. But I think it's quite good. I wish the rest of that 16 acres were as good, in fact. Yes, sir.
Does your move to Vanity Fair change the way that perhaps that you write or the way that you approach the discussions with the
Does my move to Vanity Fair change the way, the approach or whatever, right? Well, like, it remains to be seen, I guess, because I'm just sort of getting myself settled, as it were. Somewhat, maybe. It certainly doesn't change my basic viewpoint about anything. I mean, it's a decision I made for a few reasons. One of them was that it had been 15 years, and as a wise friend of mine once said, you know, every plant should be repotted every so often. Another reason is that I'm hoping in the coming year to spend more time on this, actually it's a biography, not a monograph, of Frank Gehry, and biographies are extremely challenging things to do, and in fact I'm terrified of sinking into the quicksand of it. And I keep thinking of Robert Caro, who spent the last 30 years on Lyndon Johnson, and think, oh God, you know, I cannot do that with my life. So, but I did think that a somewhat more flexible schedule in terms of the journalism I do might be helpful there, as well as just a desire for a change. And also Vanity Fair is eager for some pieces on other aspects of design, industrial design, product design, automobile design, things like that that interest me a lot that I almost never have a chance to write about. I can't say how much of that I'll actually do, but the New Yorker had zero interest in that, so even if it's just an occasional thing that goes off on one of those tangents, it will be fun and a chance to do something different. So I think it was a combination of those reasons, really. But, yeah.
You nicely characterized or contrasted the roles and orientation of the theorist and the architect as well as,
Right.
of course, the role of history playing such an important role that it does within the practice of critic. I'm curious how you characterize the historian in that.
That's an interesting question. Where does the historian fall? Well, I think, you know, generally historians who are ideologues are not the best historians because they do not go where the evidence takes them. They have decided beforehand where the evidence will take them, and then they pick and choose the evidence that supports that. But that's a pretty gross oversimplification of a much more complex and subtle process of writing history. And I think in general, any historian is likely to have a certain set of, if not biases, at least preferences and social values, but so should a critic. And ideally, he or she should start with those and then look at the evidence of the objective facts of what has happened and try to pull it all together into something coherent. I don't think a historian should start. I guess a historian in a sense is closer to what I described as the ideal viewpoint for a critic, which is to say somewhat Catholic with a small c, broad-minded, pluralistic, and yet with a sense of guiding values and priorities and principles and so forth, but also open to a range of objective evidence. That's probably the closest I can come to an answer to actually what's in fact a very interesting and impossible to completely answer question, I think. So, at least, yeah.
Given changes in technology, do you see an opportunity for a truly interactive
Interactive
architecture?
architecture? Well, I mean, to some extent, we're developing an interactive architecture already, and certainly, you know, electronics. I mean, we're doing it in two different ways. First, I think we're coming closer to experiencing space in a virtual way through technology, but also much more real space is very technology dependent, and as we use and manipulate that technology, we are, in fact, making architecture interactive. So I think we already have a sort of condition, we might say, in which architecture is somewhat interactive. How much more it will be remains to be seen. I mean, it is, in my view, at the end of the day, it is still a material object and not you know, little things in the ether. But even though architectural ideas can be in the ether, architecture itself cannot. But I think it is interactive and is becoming more so. Yes. So, yeah.
I want to celebrate English. It's been such a pleasure to hear good, sound, well-structured phrases.
Why, thank you. That is... Why, that's the nicest thing anyone's ever said to me. Thank you. You know, it's so interesting, though, you say that, because I've actually said sometimes, admittedly in exasperation to some of my students, I don't really care what you think of this building, just write a good sentence, please. and just learn how to write a good English sentence. And, you know, your opinion is your business. And unless it's utterly and staggeringly stupid, I don't really care what it is. I'm much more interested in your expressing it through convincing language. And so, so thank you for that. Is there any role for regional architecture, or is it all the same? It is increasingly the same. However, I think we can also, to a certain extent, romanticize the notion of a regional architecture. And I say that not as somebody who does not cherish the best manifestations of regional architecture, but if you're going to really be honest about it, you know, if you looked at, let's say, a Richardsonian Romanesque building put up in the 1880s in Boston, and another one in Denver, and another one in Dallas, and another one in Billings, Montana, they wouldn't be that different, in fact. So, you know, I don't know that regions were ever quite as potent as time, really. Now, and for the same, and by the same token, you know, why does Los Angeles have more in common with Houston than it does with San Francisco? If the world operated regionally, they would be more similar, but in fact, San Francisco is fundamentally a 19th century city. Los Angeles is primarily a 20th century city, as is Houston. You know, I say that with hesitation because I do not want it to be taken to imply that, there's the zeitgeist of a time and everything must follow the zeitgeist of a time, which is the old modernist argument that is superficial and ultimately not particularly convincing. And it simply wasn't true anyway. But nevertheless, if you just look back historically at how things happened, I think time was often a more powerful influence than place. I think we are obligated to admit that. On the other hand, I also think it's an important pursuit to continue to try as much as possible to buttress place, to emphasize the importance of place, and to respond to place. I tend to believe it's more often more effective not through sort of stylistic approaches, but actual real response to complex contextual issues and planning issues and social issues and so forth. Thank you all very much again. Thank you. Okay.